We've seen cases where you might, as a plant, need to signal to animals as an attraction to flowers for pollinators, attraction to fruits or seeds for dispersal. There are other functions of pigments that are not necessarily related to anything to do with animals. Sometimes pigments are a protection against stress. So these plants that change color in the fall, sometimes they're actually adding on a color. And that has to do with dealing with differences in temperature and light and the stressful environment that fall brings on. Sometimes it helps to have these pigments in place. And something I'll show you in a little bit that's kind of hinted by this illustration is that sometimes the exposure to light is actually the signal that causes this color to come in. So you can see where I'm tracing here, this leaf that's covered by the other leaf. Where it's covered is yellow, so a little more of background color. And where it's exposed to the sun, it has become red. So this plant is responding to the differences in light levels along with the change in the season, and it's throwing on some extra red pigment as a fall protectant. So here's one of the potential functions of those pigment molecules is as sunscreen. So plants have kind of a dual relationship with sunlight, as they love to have sunlight for the purposes of doing photosynthesis, but sunlight is stressful, potentially hazardous to plant cells the same way it is to our cells. So if you're out in the sun too long, you can get sunburn. You can long-term develop skin cancer. With long exposure to the sun, you increase your risk of skin cancer. So there are changes that affect the short-term function of molecules, and also the long-term can have some negative effects on DNA. So having protection from sunlight is one of the big functions of some of these pigments. So buried in there is the absorption of chlorophyll, which is doing photosynthesis. But on top of the chlorophyll are these other molecules, just kind of generalizing here, anthocyanins, carotenoids, and so on. Flavanols and anthocyanins are kind of a similar category. And they're covering an important part of the spectrum. This is the more damaging, so closer to the purple ultraviolet levels. This is the more potentially damaging levels of light, wavelengths of light, and they can be covered by these various pigments. So if you think about what pigments came around first in plants, some of the first pigments to evolve were probably doing more for light protection than they were for animal attraction. And as I mentioned a couple times, I kind of hinted at, some of these leaves are changing color in response to changes in light levels. So some plants, particularly the red colors, as plants change color into reds, the leaves change color to reds in the fall, that's often an addition, an extra color being added to the leaves. And this was from a study that pointed out a few different species that are changing their color by adding these red colors. And it's also illustrating a property of the anthocyanin. So we have red as a more anthocyanin type of color. And because it's an anthocyanin, it's water soluble. And because of that, the anthocyanin is present in the vacuole of the upper layer cells. So toward the upper layer of the leaves, the one that's catching the light first, this is where those extra pigments are. They provide kind of a shading layer for certain wavelengths of light, and that protects the cells beneath them from autumn light stresses. So you might be wondering, how important is this? It's something plants have to deal with depending on how much sun they usually get exposed to. So plants that are adapted to grow in full sun would maybe have more underlying sun protections or ways to deal with extra sun exposure. I thought this was kind of interesting. This is a commercial source where you can spray this on your crop plants and give them a little bit of sunscreen. So it's important enough that somebody capitalized on this and was able to sell people plant sunscreen. And I stole this kind of a separate image here of plants applying their own sunscreen. As I mentioned here, so we've got extra pigments in these autumn plants. And this relates to that word I used before, antioxidants. So oxidative stress is something you can get from having too much light exposure. So oxidative stress, you might have heard about free radicals. These are molecular processes that are chemical processes where there can be some damage, some oxidative stress as a result of sun exposure. And kind of separate from their sunscreening function, some of these pigment molecules also serve an antioxidant function. And this is what's usually being marketed when somebody tries to sell you on a colorful fruit. So eat this darkly colored berry, it's going to give your body some antioxidants. And that's the hope, is that you get that in your system and your body is able to fight against its own oxidative stress. People disagree about how effective that is, but it's a good, I don't know, something to think about, right, with your diet. This was from a study that was kind of comparing different parts of the world and pointing out how the leaf color was a little bit different in Eurasia than it is in North America. So North America, we have a greater proportion of deciduous trees that have leaves turning red, as opposed to these other places where they were testing. So Asia versus Europe, those relatively more yellow for whatever reason. They were correlating it with some climatic variables. And it's not just sun, it's not just oxidative stress. There's lots of other cases here, just pointing out anthocyanins protecting young leaves from insect herbivory over here. Anthocyanins protecting phototoxins. So sort of a many faceted, things get very complicated if you dig in deeper. So the whole chemical cocktail of a plant is what helps it to be effective, and natural selection is frequently acting upon the chemicals that a plant can produce. And then another one, I've had some questions from students. We do some work with seeds, and they sometimes say, why are my seeds black? Why should a plant make such black seeds? So black, of course, is like the ultimate of light absorption. So if you are a seed, and if you're a seed that ends up on the surface of the ground in a sunny place, sunny, dry place, it might be years before you are successful at getting the signals you need to germinate. This is a way that some plants can protect themselves against that sun damage while they are seeds. So embryos, endosperm also being protected from the sun, and potentially correlated with seeds that are a little more likely to be out and exposed during the time between when they're made and when they finally get where they need to be to germinate. So there's a molecule called phytomelanin, which is another one of these secondary compounds that's similar in name to melanin, which is the protein that gives us pigmentation in our skin and eyes. All right, kind of swinging a little bit more off to a different category here. Let me start a new video. Why don't I do that?